On November 13th and 14th, the Schiller Institute held an international conference titled "All Moral Resources of Humanity Have to be Called Up. Mankind must be the immortal species." Schiller Institute founder and president Helga Zepp-LaRouche addressed the existential crisis facing Afghanistan as the moral test for humanity. Will we create a new paradigm of peace and cooperation for the good of all?
David Beasley was just in Kabul, where he said that we are facing in Afghanistan the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet, where 95% of the population is in danger of starvation in the next 6 months, and that there will be hell on earth. And what is the reaction of the West? After 20 years of war, cost for the US was $2 trillion, and you have to add other NATO countries' cost, which left the country completely destroyed. The West is now withholding $9 billion by the US Treasury, 430 million by Commerzbank, similar amounts by Bundesbank, Bank of International Settlement, and so forth. And their argument is, unless the Taliban fulfill certain conditions, this money will not be delivered. What do you think will happen when more than 30 million people in Afghanistan, about to starve and freeze to death this winter, how many million will try to get to Europe? According to the International Organization on Migration, already at the end of 2020, there were 281 million migrants in the world, plus about 55 million displaced migrants within countries. That makes 336 million refugees. And with a US population of 229.5 million, that is 6 million people more than the entire US population. And this is happening under the condition of a pandemic, which is still completely out of control. Given the enormity of the crisis, this must start with an emergency crash program for the salvation of Afghanistan and Haiti with a twofold approach: an immediate, dramatic humanitarian emergency program, food, medicine, fuel, energy, shelter. For this, all the monies belonging to the Afghan people must be released, and donor countries for both Afghanistan and Haiti must immediately resume adequate aid. And there must be a full international support for the integration of Afghanistan into the Belt and Road Initiative and a real reconstruction program for Haiti. All neighboring countries of Afghanistan, the Central Asian republics, Pakistan, Iran, India, Russia, and China, have a fundamental interest to save and stabilize Afghanistan. The US and NATO countries, which have conducted the war for 20 years and left the country in a catastrophic condition, have a moral obligation to contribute to both the immediate aid and the economic buildup of the country. It should be obvious, as Lyndon LaRouche insisted already in 1973 with his biological task force, that this and other pandemics already on the horizon will only be gotten under control if the terrible underdevelopment of large parts of the planet is overcome for good. This has now to be accomplished by starting with the construction of a modern health system in every single nation, with a top priority of Afghanistan and Haiti, but naturally also Yemen, Syria, and all the other countries in terrible need. For Afghanistan, we should call it Operation Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina, or Avicenna as he is called in the West, because this outstanding figure stands for the proudest tradition of this country. There are different historical sources who debate if only the father Abdullah was born in Balkh or also Ibn Sina. Balkh being in Afghanistan, other places named are either in Uzbekistan or in Persia, Iran. It doesn't matter. He is the son of the area of Bactrian, what used to be called the land of the thousand cities around the time of the ancient Greek civilization. Ibn Sina, who was born in 980 after Christ and died in 10,037, is recognized by everybody to be the father of modern medicine. He was also a philosopher, a geologist, an astronomer. He studied earthquakes and cloud formation. He developed methods of chemistry, such as how to make sulfur. He also was an accomplished poet and wrote dramas. But especially in medicine, he made absolutely revolutionary breakthroughs. For example, he identified the function of the different organs, the pulse, the connection between the nerves and the movement of the muscles. He discovered meningitis, breast cancer, jaundice, bladder stones. He made a whole catalog of medicines. He was the first who developed psychotherapy. He wrote a compendium about the soul, a treatise how about the cure of the soul can occur, the healing of doubt and despair. He wrote more than 200 books, maybe even double the amount, and his canon of medicine was the standard works for physicians in Europe until the 17th and in some cases even the 19th century. Ibn Sina also developed a comprehensive metaphysical conception in the tradition of Plato, Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi. He developed the extremely important conception of the necessary existence, the Wahib al-Wujud, pardon my pronunciation, which is Arabic for God. All the other existences only exist according to this necessary existence concept because God makes them possible. This idea of Ibn Sina influenced many thinkers in all kinds of different religions. He was also highly regarded, among many others, by Dante, who mentioned him in the Convivio and the Divine Comedy, as well as Nicolaus von Kues, and in several texts, such as his defense of the Docta Ignorentiae against Professor Wenck and his criticisms. Cusa writes, before Avicenna, the divine Plato in the Parmenides made a very acute effort to open the road to God, because every image does not reach the truth of its exemplar. So Afghanistan needs urgently a modern hospitals, which could be built in 2 weeks, as the Chinese have proven in Wuhan. And they need modern educated doctors. Many Afghani doctors are right now in Europe or in the United States, educated nurses. And what better way than to give the effort to pull this together the name of Ibn Sina, to recall the tradition of one of the greatest thinkers of all of universal history. Avicenna is at the same time the connection between the humanist tradition of all European and Islamic nations, because of all the ideas of the ancient Greek philosophy which contributed to his work, which he in turn had then a major influence on him. And he again influenced then many thinkers in many countries. So let's make the effort to get the international aid and forces together to build a modern health system on an emergency basis in his name. And by committing ourselves to that, we in the West may also regain the integrity and the moral stature which we need to get out of this crisis. And let us call up all the great thinkers and philosophers of our traditions to join together in this effort. Operation Ibn Sina must also become the seed crystal for the cooperation between Russia, China, the US, and European nations in the effort to save Afghanistan. And if we can overcome the geopolitical thinking in this joint mission, then this can be one of the urgently needed confidence building steps to create a new model of international relations on the strategic level. To address and solve all the problems of biblical dimensions, as David Beasley of the World Food Program calls them, the world famine, the pandemic, the migrant crisis, poverty and underdevelopment of billions of people, the cooperation with the Belt and Road Initiative is the only practical and already available framework for solutions.
And as Helga said earlier, it's fundamental that we have humanitarian aid now, that the acute problems solved without any delays. So it's something that UN shares and tries to help with. Scaling up humanitarian assistance. There is a sanction regime that is an impediment for scaling up humanitarian assistance. We are not talking about lifting sanctions or altering them or review them in any short time perspective, but it's important to make decisions on exemptions that will allow economic operators and humanitarian agencies to work better on the ground. It's fundamental that the decisions are taken to unfreeze the assets, because as I said earlier, humanitarian assistance is just a patch. So money should flow to the country, and so that the salaries could be paid at this time, despite the fact that many people are working for the government, and for Americans it's a major impediment. Teachers, doctors, basic people working for basic services should get their money. Otherwise, it's very dangerous for the collapse of the country and more people fleeing the country. It's important that we do our best to preserve well-educated population, people who represent, so to say, intelligentsia of Afghanistan, those who haven't left already, because without this, it will be difficult to talk about stable Afghanistan. So I know that there are efforts on behalf of the United States to solve these issues. It's very sad that it's in terms of World Bank money and unfreezing assets, it's completely in their hands. But there is a hope that they understand that the risks that that not moving quickly will entail. But there is a space for cooperation, and if we overcome mistrust, at least for some extent, if people do not get entrenched in their requests to talibs and taking a pragmatic stance and cooperate with a spirit of cooperation, I think we can turn the tide and makes things better. But we have to move quickly and in a good faith.
If we do not investigate what went wrong in Afghanistan, then there is the danger of a repetition of the same kind of behavior in any other situation. And I also think this idea of going back several hundred centuries, the great game, the role of the British Empire. Many people think the British Empire does no longer exist, but I think that is absolutely not true. So, after all, the radical Islam would not have ever emerged without Zbigniew Brzezinski. The whole question of what happened to the various mutations of radical Islam, which are now in large part the opposition to the Taliban. I think that is not sufficiently emphasized, that the people who are now saying, oh, we have to oppose the Taliban, they are actually proposing to cooperate with the kind of terrorist organizations which are the real threat. So I think there needs to be a lot of discussion, but I think if young people would start to earnestly take up on it, that would make the absolute difference.
The real danger, as I said, is the total indifference and the cynical calculation to starve the population in order to change regime. And this is the worst hypothesis. And I'm afraid that can concretize. To have a collective punishment of people is one of the most horrible international crime according to international law. You cannot punish a population because they have a government that you don't like. Even in extreme situation in the past, for instance, North Korea and so on, international community was able to organize when they got a big problem. 15 years ago, there was a lack of food all over the country. International community intervened, even if the government was completely outcast, North Korean government. I'm really surprised badly by the fact that if they don't intervene in Afghanistan, they establish a very bad precedent. It would be the first time in which a big humanitarian crisis is not met by the international community. It is at least something that is moving on. Maybe it's positive because Afghanistan should be treated as a regional issue. Neighboring countries of the region should take care, first of all, of Afghanistan. Now, Europeans and Americans should also intervene and be active part of the reconstruction of the country. But this should occur just because they run the country for 20 years. So they have a responsibility. Urgent financial intervention, funding UN agencies that are already on the spot, funding quickly NGOs and Afghan entities that distribute food and medicine, shelter for the people who need that, and defreezing immediately the money that belongs to the African people, frozen by the Americans. The West should help a reconstruction of the country. The country was already in very bad shape in October 2001 when the Americans invaded the country. So you have a country that is destroyed by more than 30 years of civil war and by foreign invasion. That has to be rebuilt from the scratch. Even if there is some kind of development, urban development, for instance, Kabul changed, now is a much bigger city than it was 20 or 30 years ago. But most of the, not the urban, the rural Afghanistan is as it was at least 10 years ago. There are more schools, of course. There was a progress, but this progress was absolutely natural. It was all the region that grew in the last 20 years. Afghanistan just grew at a rate a bit lower than the rest of the region. So reconstruction, a big reconstruction plan for Afghanistan, taking care of the resources of the country that are relevant. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world, but this is because of the tragedy of the civil war. Potentially is a country that could be a middle income country in a relatively quick, short time, not more than 10, 15 years. Afghanistan could be completely different. It has natural resources. It has a lot of people who emigrated that can come back, bringing a lot of resources. And also is a country with a big potential, particularly in agriculture and small industry. I hope they will not do this operation that they did also in the past. They will push Afghanistan in the hands of China and Russia, because they could be the only two great power who take care of the country. And then blame Afghanistan because it moved on the so-called other side. So they basically create the threat, and then they go to fight the threat, and maybe ask the Europeans to help them in fighting a threat that they themselves created. Since they did it in the last 30 years all over, the Americans, first they create the threats, and they ask help, they offer protection from the same threat. I hope they will not repeat this with Afghanistan.
So the severe drought and confidence, the lack of confidence, let's put it this way, and then also lack of investment as a result of conflict, it resulted in a negative growth for the economy. And as a matter of fact, it depends on how you look at a projection. It is anywhere between 10 to 12%, and some have projected that indeed it could go up to 30%. A negative growth of 30% could materialize if something is not done to the economy. So you're looking at this contraction and the impact of that on the population: immense poverty, starvation, and famine. So you're looking at the economy that heavily relied on donors' assistance. The government, during the 20 years that the United States was in Afghanistan, could not generate enough revenue to be able to pay for its operating costs. So you're talking about over 40% of the operating expenses, up to 60% came from United States, and the rest of it from the revenue of customs and also other income taxes and so on. So you had a situation that the economy was not self-sufficient to begin with. Now, then you had this crisis of massive exodus of United States that came into being, and as a result of that, international community embarked on freezing Afghanistan assets, and as well as IMF, the 460 SDR, they were blocked, and World Bank stopped funding the projects, the main important sector, health sector and education sector, and the salaries of all these people actually will stop. So I had argued, and this was, I was 16 or 17, I think, in my writing as well as my interview with Reuters, BBC, and CNN and Bloomberg, I argued at that time that unless the Central Bank of Afghanistan is allowed to access its own dollar reserve. Now, remember, this is not the money, taxpayers' money of the United States. This is Afghanistan earned money. It belongs to the people of Afghanistan. I argued at that time that those should be released by Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and otherwise we will see, as I projected at that time, based on the data that we had at our disposal, that we will have spiral price increases, which we have. I said that there will be food shortages, which we have, and they said that currency will depreciate, which it has, and bank closure could come into being. To some extent, I think you have been somewhat lucky. There was some money reserve, some reserve were left in the central bank. When the new regime came into power, as a chairman of the audit committee of the bank, I got my controller general to go ahead and lock the vault and to give an accounting of all those domestic currency as well as foreign reserves that we had along with the gold. So we had a good accounting of what existed and then sealed the bank till the new regime came, and then we opened it and we actually have a good accounting of everything that was there prior to closure existed in the vault. So in that context, we had some cushion. That cushion is not going to last that long to be able to go ahead and bring price stability. You see, what happens here is that the Central Bank of Afghanistan has limited monetary tools to be able to control prices. And the instrument that has been used in the 20 years that I've been there, and a very effective instrument, and that was to be able to auction off dollars. To accumulate Afghanis and to be able to reduce the impact on currency depreciation and to be able to bring stability in prices. And that has given Afghanistan a very good record with regard to bringing down inflation.
I would just really appeal to all our viewers and listeners that, in a certain sense, you have to mobilize agape. This human species, and I think why people are not reacting, because they have become what we call depraved indifference. You can portray a picture where you say, 95% of the people in Afghanistan are in danger to die over the winter. That's what Beasley said. If you are human, this should evoke a tremendous passion to help and to make it better. So I would really appeal to you to, forget it that is a culture you may not know much about it, but I got really fascinated about the history of Afghanistan. It's very difficult because, for example, it's not so much known about Bactrian, but it was an ancient civilization at the time of the Greek ancient great civilization. There are many Greek inputs. Not enough archaeological work has been done. In any case, there is a lot to discover, and I think people have to develop passion for other cultures and other countries. And that does not mean you accept what their values are, nor should you try to proselytize and impose your values on them. I think the fact that the world is so rich, in terms of many expressions of creativity, of the human genius. I think that should motivate us, and a new narrative, if you want to call it that way, should be built on the best traditions of what every nation and every culture has contributed. And that's why I put so much emphasis on Ibn Sina. But that should be, that which links us to a more beautiful future for all of mankind. And, I want you to mobilize agape to do exactly that. Nicholas of Cusa basically talks about the microcosm and the macrocosm being governed by the same lawfulness, and you find the same idea in almost every culture, that there is such a connection between the image of man and the identity of man and the way how he relates to the physical universe at large. And I think we have to have a return to these metaphysical, ontological groundings of the image of man, and basically go back to the idea of natural law, go back to the idea of humanism, go back to the idea of the beauty in culture as that which makes culture. Schiller said, a piece of art which is not beautiful is not a piece of art. So there are many aspects about this whole question, but I think we need a classical renaissance, because if people again would have the idea that their aim is to self-perfect themselves in their life so that they can be of a better service to the country as a whole or humanity as a whole, then this would stop. This is what the Chinese are doing. They try to make things better because they think that that's right. In the West, nobody tries to make things better. People want to have more money. They want to have more this. We need this paradigm shift. And I think since we also are in the emergency, we discussed about Afghanistan. I mean, I think that is in Haiti. I could say Yemen and but I want to say Afghanistan and Haiti are the two places where that paradigm shift must become a deed and not just a word. So I would invite all of you to join with us. We have these initiatives, the Committee for Coincidence of Opposites. I really would love to get this Operation Ibn Sina going, because I think we can move mountains once a lot of people join together for a good plan.